The night came down hard on the mountains, cold as iron and just as unforgiving. Snow rode the wind like sand, cutting skin and blinding eyes, and the forest groaned beneath its weight. On a ridge above a narrow valley stood a single cabin, rough-hewn and dark, smoke leaking thin from its stone chimney. It belonged to a man who had learned to live alone, a man whose name carried weight in the hills. Folks called him Calder Knox, and they spoke it low, the way people speak of storms and old debts. He had built that cabin with his own hands, far from roads and mercy, because the world beyond had taken enough from him already. Inside, the fire cracked and popped, and Knox sat with his back to the wall, sharpening a blade that had seen more years than most men. He moved slow and steady, listening to the wind, listening for anything that did not belong. Winters like this did not forgive mistakes. Men vanished in them, and so did their regrets. Knox had learned to trust his instincts more than the weather, and tonight something pressed against those instincts like a dull ache. It came as a sound first, not loud, not clear. A scrape, then a pause. The kind of noise a branch makes when the wind toys with it, except this one had rhythm. Knox stilled his hand. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, the blade forgotten. Another scrape followed, closer now, then a weak thud against the logs of the cabin wall. His jaw tightened. No animal moved like that. No sane traveler would be out here, not dressed for this cold, not alive long enough to knock. He rose, took the rifle from its hooks, and moved to the door. Each step carried the weight of old memories, of times when opening a door had cost him blood. He lifted the latch and pulled. The wind lunged inside, dragging snow across the floor, and there, at the threshold, lay a shape that barely looked human. A woman, blue-lipped and shaking, her skin raw from cold and cruelty, hair tangled with ice. What little she wore was torn and useless, offering no warmth, no dignity. Her hands were cracked and bleeding, fingers curled like claws as she tried to pull herself forward. She did not beg. She did not cry. She simply looked up at him with eyes that refused to die. For a long moment, Knox did nothing. The mountains had taught him that pity could be a trap. Out here, mercy could get a man killed. He scanned the tree line, the darkness between the pines, half expecting shadows to move, half expecting a rifle crack to answer his hesitation. There was nothing but wind and snow and the sound of her breathing, shallow and uneven. When her strength failed, her head dropped against the threshold, and a soft sound escaped her, not a word, just pain. Knox swore under his breath. He could shut the door. He could tell himself that the cold would finish what others had started and that it was not his burden to carry. The world would not judge him, not out here. But the eyes came back to him, fierce even as they dimmed, and something old stirred in his chest. He set the rifle aside, knelt, and lifted her with care that surprised even him. She weighed almost nothing. As if the storm had already claimed most of her, he brought her inside and laid her near the fire, wrapping her in thick wool blankets, his movements practiced, gentle. He poured warm water, coaxed it past her lips, rubbed life back into her hands. As the color slowly returned to her skin, Knox studied her face. There were marks there, shadows of blows that told a story he did not yet know. Whoever had done this had not feared consequences. Whoever had left her to crawl through snow had expected her to die when she finally slept. A deep, exhausted sleep, Knox sat through the night, feeding the fire, listening to the storm rage. He thought of the rules he had made for himself, rules that kept him breathing. He had just broken the most important one. Do not invite trouble across your threshold. Do not owe the world anything. Yet as dawn crept in, pale and uncertain, he knew there was no turning back. She woke slowly, eyes darting, body tensing until she saw him in the fire and the walls that did not threaten. Her voice, when it came, was rough but steady. She told him her name was Vale, and it sounded like it belonged to someone who should have lived a gentler life. She did not offer details. She did not ask questions. She accepted the soup he gave her, the clean clothes he laid out, the space he allowed. There was pride in her still, battered but unbroken, and Knox respected it. Days passed. The storm eased, then returned, then eased again. Knox tended to her injuries with the same care he gave his traps and tools. Ilawan grew stronger, her eyes sharpening, her steps more certain. She learned the cabin's rhythms, the creak of the floorboards, the way the wind shifted before a freeze. She did not speak of the past, but sometimes Knox caught her staring at the door, as if expecting it to burst open with ghosts. Word travels even in places like this, carried by hunters and traders who pass near enough to talk. Knox heard it first from a man with frost in his beard and fear in his voice. There were riders searching the high valleys, armed and angry, asking questions about a woman who had escaped. They claimed she was a thief, a liar, a danger. Knox listened without comment, his face unreadable, but his hand tightened around his cup. That night, he found Ilawan standing outside, looking toward the dark line of the trees. The moon painted her silver, and for the first time he saw not a victim, but a survivor with a will like iron. She met his gaze and spoke plain. She said men were coming. She said they would not stop. She did not ask him to protect her. She told him she would leave before she brought war to his door. Knox shook his head once. He told her no one took what was under his roof. He told her the mountains chose their own, and sometimes they chose a fight. As the wind rose again and distant echoes carried through the valley, neither of them knew how close that fight already was. The echoes Knox had heard did not fade with the wind. They lingered in his thoughts like distant thunder that never quite breaks. He barred the door that night not because he feared the cold, but because the mountains suddenly felt crowded. Ilawan said little after that, yet her silence spoke louder than fear. She moved through the cabin with purpose, folding blankets, cleaning the table, learning where Knox kept his tools and food. It was not the behavior of someone waiting to be rescued. It was the behavior of someone preparing for another escape. Even if her body still carried pain. Knox watched her from the corner of his eye as he repaired a snowshoe strap. He had seen that look before in men who knew trouble was hunting them. Ilawan carried it with a different weight, sharp and quiet. When he finally asked where she had come from, she did not answer right away. She stared into the fire, fingers curled around a tin cup, and the flames reflected in her eyes like restless spirits. She spoke of a settlement far east of the ridge, a place run by a man named Rourke Blackthorn. His name alone made the air in the cabin feel heavier. Blackthorn controlled trade routes, passes, and people. He decided who ate well and who went hungry. Ilawan had worked in his house, not by choice, and she chose her words carefully, avoiding details that still cut too deep. She said she learned things there, things men like Blackthorn never expected a woman to notice. Ledgers, deals, names whispered behind closed doors. When she tried to leave with that knowledge, she became a problem that needed to disappear. Knox listened without interruption. He knew Blackthorn by reputation. Everyone did. The man had money, guns, and followers who asked no questions. If Blackthorn was searching these mountains, it meant Ilawan was worth more alive or dead than Knox liked to think about. He felt the old instinct rise again, the one that told him to prepare or perish. The next morning, Knox took stock of his supplies with new eyes. Ammunition, dried meat, medicine, all counted twice. He showed Ilawan how to load a rifle, correcting her stance, guiding her hands without a word wasted. She learned fast. Her shoulders squared, her breath steadied, and when she fired, the sound echoed clean and true across the valley. Knox nodded once. Approval from him was never loud. Tracks appeared 2 days later, half buried by fresh snow but clear enough to read if you knew how. Knox crouched low, fingers brushing the ground, jaw tight. Horses, several of them, moving slow and careful. These were not lost travelers. These were men who expected resistance. He followed the trail just far enough to confirm his fear, then turned back, erasing signs of his own passage as he went. Ilawan met him at the cabin door. She did not ask what he had seen. She could read it on his face. She packed what she could into a canvas sack, her movements controlled, eyes steady. Knox stopped her with a raised hand. He told her the cabin was no place to abandon in winter. He told her the mountains could hide them better together than apart. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Trust was not easy for either of them, but necessity had a way of forcing it. That night, Knox spoke of his own past, not in full, but enough. He had once ridden with men who believed power was something you took and held by force. He had learned too late what that kind of life demanded in return. When he left scars behind, and some of those scars still carried names. He had built his cabin far from roads because distance was the only peace he knew how to claim. Ilawan listened, understanding more than she said. She admitted she had taken something from Blackthorn, something small but dangerous. Not gold, not weapons, but proof. Proof that could unmake him if it reached the right hands. She had hidden it before the chase began, trusting no one. Knox asked where. She shook her head. Some things, she said, were safer unknown, even to allies. The days grew tense. Knox set snares and watch points, marking trees, planning paths only he could follow. Ilawan learned to move quietly through snow, to read the wind, to listen for sounds that did not belong. At night they spoke in low voices, sharing meals by the fire. The silence between them growing easier. Heavier with unspoken understanding. Then came the first sign that Blackthorn's men were close enough to touch. A shot rang out at dawn, distant but deliberate. Not a warning, but a message. Knox's expression hardened. He knew the tactic. Let the hunted know they were seen. Let fear do the work. Ilawan did not flinch, but her hands tightened around her cup. Later that day, a man approached the cabin alone, hands raised, voice carrying smooth and calm through the trees. He called himself Silas Crow, said he came to talk. Knox watched from the window, rifle ready, recognizing the confidence of someone who believed the outcome already decided. Crow spoke of misunderstandings, of a woman who belonged to Blackthorn, of rewards for cooperation. His eyes flicked toward the door as if he could see through it. Knox answered from inside, voice flat, telling Crow to leave his land. Crow smiled, a thin thing that never reached his eyes. He said winter made men unreasonable, and Blackthorn was patient, but not endlessly so. When he finally turned away, his footsteps echoed too loudly for someone alone. Knox counted the seconds, the sounds, the spaces between them. That night, Ilawan confessed her fear was not for herself alone. She believed Blackthorn wanted her alive because she knew where his weakest ties lay. Names of men who would abandon him if pressed, roots that could be cut, deals that could be exposed. Knox realized then that sheltering her was not just an act of mercy. It was a challenge thrown into the teeth of a powerful enemy. The wind rose again, carrying distant voices, the clink of metal, the soft whinny of horses. Knox extinguished the lantern and guided Ilawan to the back room, his hand firm on her shoulder. Outside, shadows moved where there should have been none. The cabin stood quiet, waiting as the mountains held their breath. And the hunt drew closer without yet revealing its final shape. The night pressed close around the cabin, heavy with sound and shadow. Knox stayed awake, seated near the door with the rifle across his knees, listening to the way the forest breathed. Ilawan rested in the back room, but sleep did not come easy to her. Every snap of wood in the fire pulled her back to alertness. She knew the quiet was false. Men like Blackthorn never rushed. They circled, tested, waited for weakness. Outside, Silas Crow and the others made camp just far enough to stay hidden. Crow crouched near a low fire, eyes on the dark shape of the cabin through the trees. He admired Knox in a distant way. Men who lived alone in places like this were either fools or ghosts. Blackthorn had sent Crow because he understood patience better than most. He believed fear ripened faster when watered slowly by morning. Knox had changed the land around the cabin without leaving a mark a careless eye could spot. Snow hid most of his work, but he knew where every step would betray weight, where every turn narrowed escape. Ilawan watched him from the doorway, memorizing what she could. She did not ask questions. She trusted his judgment the way one trusts a river, not to run backward as the day wore on. Memories clawed at Knox. He remembered another winter. Another standoff when he had followed orders instead of instinct. He remembered a cabin not unlike this one, surrounded by men who believed they were righteous. That memory kept his hands steady and his heart cold. He would not repeat that mistake, no matter the cost. Ilawan spent the afternoon sorting through old supplies, finding scraps of cloth and wire, anything that could be used twice. Her mind worked constantly, tracing paths beyond the ridge, recalling faces from Blackthorn's settlement. She wondered which of those men would ride against her now and which would turn away if given the chance. She carried the proof she had taken like a weight in her thoughts. A bargaining chip that could either save her or doom them both. Late in the day, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, unarmed and walking slow. It was not Crow this time, but a younger man with a hard face and uncertain eyes. He called out a name Alawan had not heard in months. It was a name tied to her past, spoken once with warmth. She froze, heart pounding. Knox watched her reaction and understood enough to know this was no coincidence. The man claimed he had come alone. That he wanted to talk? He said Blackthorn promised mercy if Alawan returned quietly. He spoke of warmth, food, safety. Alawan stepped forward before Knox could stop her, her voice steady as ice. She asked him how many times Blackthorn had promised mercy before. The man looked away, shame flickering across his face. Knox raised the rifle just enough to remind him of consequences. The man left without another word, his retreat slower than his approach. That encounter left a crack in Eloin's resolve she tried to hide. Knox noticed it in the way she stood closer to the fire, in the way her hands trembled when she thought no one watched. He said nothing, knowing strength returned faster when not called out. Instead, he showed her a narrow trail behind the cabin, one only visible when the light hit right. He told her it led to high ground and deeper cover if things turned bad. She nodded, committing it to memory. Meanwhile, Crow reported back to Blackthorn through a runner who knew the passes. Blackthorn listened in silence, fingers drumming on the table. He did not like resistance, especially from a man he had once considered useful. Knox's defiance made this personal. Blackthorn ordered the net tightened, not closed. He wanted Alawan desperate enough to choose him over the mountain. Snow fell again that night, thick and blinding. The wind carried voices closer than before, laughter forced and sharp. Knox put out the fire early, plunging the cabin into darkness. Alawan sat beside him, their breaths quiet, bodies tense. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped, followed by the soft crunch of boots. Knox waited, counting heartbeats until the sound passed. This was not an attack. It was a warning. At dawn, they found the sign Blackthorn meant them to see. A dead deer lay near the tree line, throat cut clean, its blood staining the snow. No meat taken? Just a message. Alawan swallowed hard, anger flaring brighter than fear. Knox felt it too, the challenge laid bare. He knew Blackthorn's kind. This would not end quickly. As days blurred together, the pressure grew. Knox caught glimpses of movement on ridges, heard distant calls meant to confuse and tire. Alawan began to dream aloud, fragments of the past slipping through her guard. She spoke of ledgers hidden beneath floorboards, of meetings held at night, of men who smiled while planning ruin. Knox listened, piecing together a picture larger than his cabin, larger than the valley. One evening, as the sky burned red behind the peaks, Alawan told Knox the truth she had held back. The proof she carried could tear Blackthorn's empire apart, but only if delivered to the right hands. Those hands lay far beyond the mountains, across lands Blackthorn controlled. Getting there would mean leaving the cabin and stepping into open danger. Knox did not answer right away. He stared out at the horizon, weighing paths he had sworn never to walk again, unseen by them. Crow studied the cabin from a new angle, marking Knox's patterns, noting Eloin's movements. He respected their resilience, even as he prepared to break it. He believed everyone had a price or a breaking point. He only needed time to find it. The mountains stood silent witness as night fell once more. Inside the cabin, Knox sharpened his blade while Alawan checked the rifle. Each lost in thought, bound by a shared fate neither had chosen but both now carried. Outside, the circle tightened, the storm gathered, and the space between mercy and survival grew thinner with every passing hour. The mountains seemed to lean in closer, as the days narrowed toward something inevitable. Knox felt it in the way sound traveled shorter now, how even the wind carried weight. Alawan felt it too. She moved with purpose, no longer just surviving but preparing. Fear had not left her, but it had hardened into resolve, and that made her dangerous in a way Blackthorn had not expected. Knox decided it was time to stop waiting. He told Alawan they would not be cornered like animals. The cabin was strong, but still just wood and stone. The land beyond it was their real ally. He began moving supplies in small amounts to hidden caches along the ridge, places only he could find again. Alawan followed, memorizing paths, learning how the mountain folded in on itself. She left no trail, her steps careful, her breath measured. Silas Crow noticed the change. He saw fewer signs near the cabin, fewer mistakes. That worried him more than defiance. Men who planned to flee left chaos behind. Men who planned to fight cleaned their ground. Crow sent word to Blackthorn that Knox was shifting tactics. Blackthorn's reply came back cold and simple. Press harder. Make them choose. The pressure came swiftly. Shots rang out from distant slopes, not aimed to kill but to herd. Smoke rose from a stand of trees Knox used for cover, fire set to force movement. Alawan watched the flames climb and felt anger tighten her chest. That forest had sheltered her when she could barely walk. Blackthorn was burning more than wood. He was burning her patience. That night, Knox and Alawan spoke plainly for the first time about what lay ahead. Knox admitted that holding ground forever was impossible. Blackthorn had numbers and time. Alawan admitted that the proof she carried was worth more than either of them alone. Together, it was leverage. They agreed on one thing. They would choose the moment of their stand, not Blackthorn. Unbeknownst to them, doubt had begun to spread among Blackthorn's men. Some had ridden with him long enough to know his hunger never ended. They whispered around low fires, questioning why so many resources were spent chasing one woman and one mountain man. A few remembered Eloin's quiet competence, the way she had once warned them of bad deals before ruin followed. Seeds of doubt took root in the cold. Knox sensed the shift when a trap was sprung and then carefully disarmed by hands that knew what they were doing. That was not Crow's style. That was a message. Someone out there did not want blood spilled unnecessarily. Knox marked it in his mind. Another angle to watch. As the circle tightened, Alawan made a choice of her own. She revealed the location of the proof, hidden in a place no rider would think to search. It was close, too close for comfort, buried beneath the cabin floor where Knox had never thought to look. He stared at her, surprised, then nodded. Trust, once given, carried weight. The next morning dawned clear and bitter. Crow approached again, this time with more men visible in the open. He did not smile. He spoke of endings, of offers expiring. He said Blackthorn himself was riding closer. That name hung in the air like a threat made solid. Alawan stepped beside Knox, her posture calm, her voice steady. She told Crow that Blackthorn's reach ended here. Crow laughed softly, but his eyes flicked to the ridges. Uneasy. Knox saw his opening then, not in Crow's words, but in the men behind him. One shifted his weight, another avoided Knox's gaze. These were not soldiers driven by loyalty. They were men calculating survival. Knox raised his voice just enough for all to hear. He spoke of Blackthorn's lies, of promises that ended in shallow graves. He spoke of winter and who would be blamed when bodies did not return. Alawan added her voice, naming deals that had gone bad, names that made some faces pale. Crow cut them off, anger flashing. He ordered his men back, but the command lacked its usual sharpness. As they withdrew, Knox knew the battle had shifted, not won, but changed. Blackthorn would not tolerate doubt. That made him dangerous in a new way. The first true clash came at dusk. A small group tried to slip around the ridge, moving fast and quiet. Knox had anticipated it. Snow and darkness favored him. He used noise and shadow, guiding them into confusion, never showing himself long enough to be pinned. Alawan stayed close, steady and focused, covering paths Knox could not see. When it ended, the intruders retreated, shaken but alive. The message was clear. This ground was not free. That night, Alawan sat by the fire, hands shaking at last. Knox placed a cup in her grip, grounding her. She admitted she feared what Blackthorn would do when pushed too far. Knox answered with a truth she needed to hear. Men like Blackthorn broke when their control slipped. They lashed out, and in doing so, exposed themselves. That exposure was the opening they needed. Far below, Rourke Blackthorn rode into the outer valley, his presence felt before seen. He was calm, confident, convinced that force and fear would still bend this situation to his will. Crow briefed him carefully, omitting the cracks. Blackthorn listened, eyes narrowed, already planning a decisive move. He did not believe in STLEMATES. As Blackthorn drew closer, the mountains seemed to hold their breath. Knox and Alawan prepared for one last stand, not knowing exactly where it would fall. Supplies were placed, escape routes marked, signals agreed upon. Their partnership had become seamless, built on necessity and respect. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The final night before everything changed arrived with an unnatural stillness. No shots, no voices, just silence heavy enough to press against the ears. Knox knew this was the calm before Blackthorn struck. Alawan felt it too, her pulse steady but fast. They stood at the cabin door, looking out at the dark valley where torches would soon appear. Somewhere beyond the trees, Blackthorn gathered his men, ready to close his fist. Somewhere closer, doubt and fear shifted loyalties. And in the narrow space between, a mountain man and a woman who refused to break waited for the moment that would decide whether mercy or power would rule the dawn. The first rays of dawn spilled over the mountains, lighting the snow in a soft glow that belied the tension lingering in the valley. Knox stood at the cabin's edge, rifle in hand, scanning the distant ridges. Torches flickered in the morning mist, moving slowly as Blackthorn's men advanced. Silence stretched tight between the two sides, each waiting for the first move, each weighing the consequences of rash action. Knox's eyes shifted to Ellen, who had taken her place beside him, eyes steady, hands gripping her own rifle. There was no fear in her now, only resolve. The storm had made them stronger. Blackthorn rode into view soon after, a towering figure atop a black stallion. He brought with him a wave of men. But Knox noticed something off. Their formation was tight but cautious, the rhythm of uncertainty in their steps. Crow rode beside Blackthorn, his face grim, as if he had begun to sense cracks in the plan he had helped craft. The air was cold and biting, but neither Knox nor Alawan flinched. They had faced far worse than cold and shadow. Knox raised his hand, not to fire, but to call attention. He shouted across the valley, voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. He told Blackthorn that the woman he sought was not a prize, but a reckoning. Alawan followed, her voice rising in perfect harmony with his, naming the deeds Blackthorn had tried to bury, the debts unpaid, the betrayals ignored. The words carried across the snow, reaching ears that had never known they were witnesses to the truth. A murmur ran through Blackthorn's ranks. Men shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at their leader, and then at each other. Knox and Alawan did not need to shoot. The power of their voices, their combined resolve, had begun to erode fear and loyalty among the enemy. Blackthorn's eyes burned with anger, but even he could feel the shift. Control, which he had always believed absolute, was no longer his alone. The tension exploded suddenly. A rider misjudged his path and stumbled, a shout cutting through the morning like a knife. Other men reacted instinctively, their formation breaking as some drew weapons while others held back. Knox moved quickly, guiding Alawan behind a ridge for cover, but there was no panic in their steps. They had prepared for this. Every move, every hidden path, every cached supply was accounted for. This was the moment they had been shaping, not by chance, but by foresight and courage. Amid the chaos, a small group of Blackthorn's men, the ones most uncertain of their loyalty, hesitated. They glanced at one another, then at the women and men standing firm on the ridge. Knox watched them closely. He recognized indecision because he had lived it. These men had a choice: follow a tyrant into destruction or step back from the brink. Quietly, silently, a handful slipped away, moving toward the trees and disappearing into the snow, leaving Blackthorn with fewer hands than he had counted on. Crow's face tightened. His careful plan was unraveling before him. Blackthorn's fury was quick and fierce. He called for an attack, ordering men forward. But Knox and Alawan were not waiting. They used the terrain to their advantage, guiding movements, creating obstacles, forcing confusion without spilling unnecessary blood. Snow and shadow became allies, and the enemy's certainty became their undoing. Illawan moved with precision, signaling knocks when paths opened or closed. Together they controlled the flow of the confrontation, leading their pursuers into positions of vulnerability at the heart of the chaos. Knox and Illawan confronted the core of the threat, Blackthorn himself and Crow. The two men charged, confident that sheer force could overcome skill and will. But Knox had no intention of meeting them head-on. He maneuvered with intent, and Illawan, once cornered and beaten, now a force of her own, moved alongside him with unmatched focus. Together, they forced the enemy into a situation where brute strength meant nothing. Where hesitation and doubt became their undoing, the confrontation reached its peak when Knox and Illawan stood against Blackthorn in the open, their presence commanding the attention of everyone around. Words were exchanged, accusations and truths laid bare. Knox's voice rang like a bell, steady and unyielding. Illawan's followed, calm but cutting, naming every betrayal, every lie, every broken promise. The men surrounding them began to see not a battle of weapons, but a battle of consequence and honor. Blackthorn's empire of fear, built on compliance and intimidation, trembled under the weight of truth. Then came the moment of choice. Some of Blackthorn's men, already doubting their leader, stepped back, refusing to move forward. Others lowered their weapons slowly, recognizing the futility of blind obedience. Crow hesitated, then finally turned away, understanding that loyalty built on fear could not withstand conviction and courage. Blackthorn, alone and enraged, had nothing left to command. His plan had collapsed without a single shot fired at those who had prepared to fight. Knox and Illawan stood firm, their eyes meeting, the unspoken acknowledgement of victory and survival passing between them. With the danger subsiding, Knox and Illawan returned to the cabin, not as hunted fugitives, but as survivors and architects of their own fate. They worked together to ensure every path into the valley was secure, every hidden cache accounted for, not for revenge, but for the peace they had earned. Illawan, once fragile and beaten, now moved with confidence, tending the cabin, sharpening tools, and preparing for the months ahead. Knox, who had lived in solitude for so long, found purpose in shared vigilance. No longer alone in the mountains, he called home. In the weeks that followed, the valley returned to its quiet rhythm. The snow melted gradually, revealing the rugged beauty of the ridges and the trees. Illawan and Knox rebuilt not just the cabin but the trust and connection between them, strong and unspoken. News of Blackthorn's failed campaign spread slowly, a whisper of justice carried by those who had observed the mountain stand. The mountains themselves seemed to exhale, returning to the silent guardianship they had always held. Illawan finally spoke of the proof she had carried, sharing it carefully, ensuring that Blackthorn could never rise again. Knox assisted, watching as the power of knowledge and courage brought balance back to the settlements below. They did not seek praise or reward, only the quiet satisfaction of righting a wrong and claiming a life that had once seemed impossible. The scars, both visible and hidden, remained, but they were reminders of survival and resilience, not just pain. Life settled into a new rhythm. Knox and Illawan shared meals, repaired tools, and spoke of distant plans, of places beyond the mountains where peace might last longer than a single season. The valley, once a place of pursuit and danger, became home, a sanctuary earned through perseverance, courage, and trust. They laughed quietly at times, remembering how fear had once driven them, marveling at the strength they had discovered in one another. The story of what had happened in the mountains became legend among travelers and neighbors, a tale of defiance and mercy, of strength earned through hardship and choice. Knox, who had once believed solitude was protection, now understood that connection, trust, and courage were stronger shields than any wall of wood or stone. Illawan, who had crawled through snow-broken and beaten, now moved through life like a queen of her own making, not because of power, but because of resilience and the choice to stand and fight with honor. As winter faded and spring breathed life back into the valley, Knox and Illawan watched the sunrise together from the cabin's ridge. The wind carried no threat now, only the quiet promise of days shaped by their own hands. They had survived, and in doing so discovered not just safety, but the deep truth of trust, courage, and human connection. The mountains had tested them. The enemy had challenged them, and through it all, they had found not just survival, but a future worth living, and in the calm that followed, Knox finally allowed himself to see the possibilities beyond defense and survival. Eloin's presence, her strength, and her insight brought warmth to a life that had known only hardship. Together they planned for a future unshaken by fear, built not on power or intimidation, but on loyalty, wisdom, and the quiet certainty that they had earned their peace. The cabin, once a refuge, became a home, a testament to courage, endurance, and the unbreakable bond forged in the fiercest of storms.